Walter Schuck and Joseph Peterbers, April 10, 1945. 1400 hours, 38 minutes. April 10th, 1945. Somewhere above Berlin, 10 American airmen have just been burned alive inside a B-17 flying fortress called Moonlight Mission. 10 more before them. 10 more before those. 4 flying fortresses, up to 40 American boys from Nebraska, from Pennsylvania, from Ohio, from small towns their families had never left before the war, killed in 8 minutes by one German fighter pilot flying the fastest aircraft on Earth. His name is Walter Schuck, 24 years old. He has just reached 206 aerial victories. He is, at this exact moment, the most dangerous man in the sky over Europe. 3,000 feet above him, a 20-year-old kid from Wisconsin who had been on his way to a Catholic seminary. Before Pearl Harbor rerouted, his life lines up his gun sight on the back of Schuck's head. His name is Joseph Peterbers. He is flying his 49th combat mission. He is about to do something that no one, not the US Army Air Force, not the German Luftwaffe, not Peterbers himself, will believe for the next 60 years. This is the story of 8 minutes over Berlin, one propeller-driven Mustang named Josephine, and the moment a farm country boy from Wisconsin killed the Luftwaffe's last great ace. And why, 6 decades later, that same German ace would look Joseph Peterbers in the eye and say 7 words that no one in the room was expecting. "You are the man who saved me. Stay with me." Because to understand how that sentence was possible, how gratitude, not hatred, was the last word between 2 men who once tried to kill each other over Berlin, you have to go back to a laugh. A laugh in October 1943, a laugh that would cost Germany the sky. October 14th, 1943. 15,000 feet above Schweinfurt, Bavaria. The sky is a slaughterhouse. 291 American bombers crossed the German coast at dawn. By sunset, 60 will be gone. 600 American airmen, killed, captured, missing. The Americans will call this day Black Thursday. The German pilots have another name for it. They call it a turkey shoot. And in the officers' mess at Wunstorf that evening, they laugh. They laugh because they have solved a mathematical problem the Americans still refuse to accept. American bombers cannot survive over Germany without fighter escort, and no Allied fighter on Earth has the range to fly them all the way in. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt can reach the German border with drop tanks. No further. The twin-engine P-38 Lightning can fly deeper, but its engines freeze at high altitude. So the German fighter pilots wait. They track the bomber streams on radar. They calculate, down to the minute, the exact point where the American escorts must turn back for home. And when the little friends peel away, when the bomber gunners see their guardians disappear into the western horizon, the Luftwaffe pounces. They call it the golden moment. But the German pilots do not know something that night. 4,000 miles to the west, in a factory in Inglewood, California, and another factory in Dallas, Texas, the object of their coming nightmare is already rolling off the assembly line. They do not know its name yet, but they will. Now let me tell you about a coal miner's son from a small village in the Saarland. Walter Schuck was born on the 30th of July, 1920, in Frankenholz, a village so small that if you drove through it at night with your headlights off, you would not know you had passed a town at all. His father worked in the coal mines. His mother worked at home. Walter grew up on black bread and root vegetables and the sound of pit whistles in the morning fog. He did not care about Adolf Hitler. He did not care about the 1,000-year Reich. He cared about airplanes. At 16 years old, in 1936, he walked into a Luftwaffe recruitment office and volunteered. They told him to come back next year. He came back next year. They accepted him. By April of 1942, Walter Schuck was 21 years old, wearing the wings of a Luftwaffe fighter pilot and stationed on the most forgotten front line of the entire Second World War. The Arctic, WWII 5, nickname Eismeer, the Ice Sea. You will not read about this front in most history books. There were no famous battles there, no sweeping tank offensives, no newsreels. Just an endless white, nothing above the Arctic Circle, where German pilots and Soviet pilots hunted each other over frozen fjords and reindeer trails and villages so remote they still had no electricity. Temperatures on the flight line dropped to -40 degrees. If you crashed on the tundra and could not signal your position within an hour, you would not survive the night. Wolves would find you before your own side did. Walter Schuck flew there for 2 years. By April 8, 1944, he had shot down 84 Soviet aircraft, Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross. By September 30th, 171. Oak leaves. In his memoir, a book he would write decades later, titled Abschuss, Walter Schuck described the Arctic front like this: "In the north, we were still knights of the air. Man against man, machine against machine. The fight was hard, but it was clean." Remember that sentence, because in a few months, Walter Schuck is going to leave the Arctic. He is going to be summoned back to the fatherland. He is going to be handed the keys to the fastest fighter aircraft ever built by human hands. And he is going to discover that the war he trained for no longer exists. Walter Schuck thought he was being promoted. When the transfer orders arrived in early 1945, moving him from WWII 5 in the Arctic to WWII 7 at Parchim in central Germany, he believed the fatherland had finally recognized what he was worth. WWII 7 was the elite, the first operational jet fighter unit in the history of aviation. What no one told him was that WWII 7 was not the future. It was the last stand. Because while Walter Schuck was still hunting Soviet biplanes in the Arctic snow, something had happened in the skies over Germany. March 4th, 1944. 25,000 feet above Brandenburg, 660 American heavy bombers are droning east in perfect formation. Below them, the sprawling grey outline of Berlin. The capital of the Reich, the city Reich Marshal Hermann Göring had personally sworn would never see an enemy aircraft in its skies. And weaving between the bombers, in tight protective formations, are dozens of single-engine fighters. They are silver. They have long, tapered noses. They wear white American stars on their fuselages. The German controllers on the ground are screaming into their radios in disbelief, because these fighters are not P-47 Thunderbolts, which should have turned back over the Dutch coast 300 kilometers ago. They are something else. They are P-51 Mustangs, and they have followed the bombers all the way to Berlin. For the first time in the war, senior German officers begin to speak quietly of a possibility no one has been willing to say out loud. The war may be lost. Adolf Galland, the 32-year-old general of the fighter arm, had warned Göring for a year that this exact scenario was coming. He had been ignored. Now the scenario had arrived, and the Reich had no answer for it. But Göring will not admit any of this in public, because if the pilots knew, if Walter Schack, still fighting his private war in the Arctic, understood what had already happened over Berlin, he might have refused to come home. He might have stayed in the ice. Instead, he boarded a train. The train carried him south, into the ruins of a country he no longer recognized. Bombed cities, blackened churches, children with hollow eyes. And at the end of the journey, at an airfield called Parchim, a machine was waiting for him. Twin turbojet engines, a shark-nose fuselage, 4 30mm cannons that could tear a B-17 apart in a single burst. The Messerschmitt 262, the Swallow. Walter Schack ran his hand along its cold metal skin, and for a moment, for one final moment, he believed the laughter was going to return. Let me tell you what a German fighter pilot did every morning in the spring of 1945. You wake up before the sun, not because the alarm sounds, because you never really slept. You put on your flight suit. It smells of oil and old sweat and the fear you carried out of yesterday's mission. You walk out to the flight line. Your Messerschmitt 262 is sitting there in the pale grey dawn, the most advanced fighter aircraft ever built. 870 kilometers per hour, 4 30mm cannons. A machine so far ahead of its time that Allied engineers will still be studying it 40 years later. And it cannot fly today, because there is no fuel. The synthetic oil plants at Luna and Pölitz and Brooks, the ones the Americans have been bombing for 8 months straight, have collapsed. In April of 1944, Germany produced 175,000 tons of aviation fuel. By September, 10,000. 10,000 tons for an entire air force. Colonel Johannes Steinhoff, commanding Jagdgeschwader 7, wrote in his diary the sentence that would haunt him for the rest of his life. We had the world's first operational jet fighter, and we could barely fuel them. I watched helplessly as dozens of these superb aircraft sat idle while Mustangs roamed freely overhead. The arithmetic of the air war had become impossible for Germany. The United States had produced 15,486 P-51 Mustangs during the war. On any given day, the 8th Air Force alone could put over 1,000 of them into the sky. Against them, the Luftwaffe could muster perhaps 300 serviceable fighters, half grounded for lack of fuel, the other half flown by teenagers. Teenagers. That is not a figure of speech. By January of 1945, the average German fighter pilot arriving at a combat squadron had 40 to 50 hours of flight time. American pilots arrived with 300 to 400 hours. One captured German pilot put it this way: I flew my first combat mission in November of 1944 with 55 hours of flight time. On my third mission, I saw Mustangs for the first time. They were everywhere. I knew then that we had lost. Not just the war, the sky itself. Colonel Heinz Baer, 220 confirmed aerial victories, said it more bluntly than anyone else. The Mustang killed the Luftwaffe, not the bombers, not the invasion. That one fighter, the one that could fly to Poland and back. This is the world Walter Schack flew into when he arrived at Parchim in February of 1945. The Arctic had been a knight's tournament. Germany was a slaughterhouse. Here is what nobody outside the Luftwaffe understood about the Messerschmitt 262. On paper, it was invincible. Roughly 160 kilometers per hour faster, than a P-51 Mustang. But it spent about 90% of its flying life not at cruise power. It spent it taking off or landing. And during those two moments, those two agonizing, vulnerable moments, the Tu-62 was the most helpless combat aircraft in the entire European theater. The Jumo turbojets could not maneuver at low speed. A landing pilot had to commit. He had to come in low, slow, straight, and steady, which is exactly when American pilots learned to attack. They stopped chasing Tu-62s in the air. They started hunting them at their nests. They would loiter over the German airfields, and they would wait. They would circle at altitude until a German jet appeared, low on fuel, committed to its landing pattern, and then they would strike. The German pilots called it Rattenjagd, the rat hunt, because they were the rats. Now let me put you inside the cockpit of Walter Schuck on the morning of April 10th, 1945. You are strapping yourself into a Messerschmitt Tu-62 at the airfield in Parchim. Radio traffic has been intercepted. American radar has painted a bomber stream inbound from the west. 1,500 heavy bombers escorted by fighters. Their target appears to be the airfields around Oranienburg, just north of Berlin. You are ordered to intercept. You climb into the cockpit. You slide the canopy shut. You listen to the whine of the Jumo turbines spooling up on either side of you. You have flown 500 combat missions. You have shot down 202 aircraft. But you have not felt this feeling before, because for the first time in your entire flying career, you understand, with a clarity that no one has ever spoken out loud, that this may be your last takeoff, not because you are afraid, because the numbers no longer make sense. 1,400 hours, 30 minutes. You have found them. The B-17 formation is stacked in a long, staggered column below you, protected on its flanks by fighter escorts, too high to intervene in time. You bank left and you dive. 275 meters. That is the distance at which you open fire. Your 4 Mk-108 cannons hammer the airframe of the aircraft in front of you. 30mm shells, each one shorter than a soda can, but carrying enough high explosive to bring down a train, smash into the wing root of the B-17. The wing folds upward like paper. The bomber begins to spin. 4,000 liters of aviation fuel ignite. 10 men are inside that aircraft. Some of them are still alive as it enters the spin. You do not see this. You are already climbing away. You are already looking, and for the next you find him 30 seconds later. Another B-17. His name is Moonlight Mission, 457th Bomb Group. You come at him from behind and slightly below, and you fire. He falls. You climb. You find another one, Hen's Revenge, of the 303rd Bombardment Group. You fire. He falls. 8 minutes, from the first burst to the fourth kill. 8 minutes, 4 flying fortresses. Up to 40 American airmen, dead, dying, or falling through freezing air in parachutes riddled with cannon fragments. You have just reached 206 aerial victories. You are, at this exact moment, one of the most successful fighter pilots in the history of aerial combat. And in less than 2 minutes, you will not know your own name. The impact comes without warning. It is not a sound, it is a feeling. A hammer blow against the left side of your aircraft, a jolt that runs from the tips of your wings into the base of your spine. You look left. Your left engine is on fire. The Jumo turbojet, the miracle of German engineering, the machine that made you invincible, is trailing a rope of black, oily smoke back into the grey German sky. You look behind you. You see nothing. There is nothing there. No enemy aircraft, no wingman. In your entire 206 victories, you have always seen the enemy who was trying to kill you. That was the rule. That was what made you a knight of the air. Whoever just shot you was invisible. Walter Schuck, ace of aces, veteran of 500 combat missions, has just been defeated from his blind spot by a 20-year-old American in his 49th combat mission. A boy who had barely 20 hours in the P-51 Mustang when he first started flying it 4 months ago. You will not know this for 60 years. You cannot know it now. The Messerschmitt 262 rolls slowly to the left. The horizon tips sideways in your canopy. You pull the stick. It does not respond. You are going to have to jump. You reach for the canopy jettison lever. Your gloved hand is shaking. Not from fear, from the truth. The truth that 6 years of war, the ice, the tundra, the burning airfields, the friends you buried in unmarked graves in Norway, all of it ends now in a burning aircraft. Above a country you no longer recognize, shot down by a pilot you never saw, you pull the lever. The canopy blows away. Freezing air rushes into the cockpit. You unstrap. You brace your feet against the seat, and you push yourself out into the sky. For a moment, a strange floating moment that will stay with you for the next 70 years, you are simply falling. Just sky and cloud and the sound of the wind in your ears. Then the ground begins to grow. You pull the parachute cord. You hit the ground hard. Both of your ankles roll sideways beneath you in the same instant. The pain is white. You cannot stand. You cannot walk. You try to push yourself up, and you fall forward into the wet spring earth of central Germany. Your war is over. You will not know this for another 8 weeks, until a German military doctor tells you, in a field hospital that no longer has electricity, that both of your ankles are so badly sprained that you will not fly again this year. And by the time you can fly again, there will be no Germany left to fly for. But Joseph Peterbers was not going home either. After firing at the Me-262, Peterbers had followed his instincts down through the cloud layer, and on the other side of that cloud, he had found something no 20-year-old should ever have found alone. A German airfield, crowded with aircraft, undefended. He dove, he strafed, he kept coming back. Pass after pass, his 650 caliber Browning machine guns tore across the flight line. He destroyed at least 5 German aircraft on the ground, including a 4-engine Focke-Wulf 200 Condor. He set a hangar on fire. He came back one more time, and on that last pass, German anti-aircraft fire found him. His Merlin engine, the Rolls-Royce heart of his Mustang, began to overheat. Oil sprayed across his screen. He tried to nurse the aircraft 140 kilometers toward friendly lines. He did not make it. A Focke-Wulf 190 spotted him low and slow and streaming smoke and made one final pass. At an altitude of only 100 meters, with fire in his cockpit and no forward visibility, Joseph Peterbers bailed out of Josephine near the town of Berg, 30 kilometers northeast of Magdeburg. His parachute barely had time to open. He struck the tail of his own aircraft on the way out. He landed in a field, burned along the left side of his face, with 20 German farmers running toward him, carrying rakes and axes and pitchforks. He thought they were going to kill him. Then a Luftwaffe sergeant on a motorcycle appeared out of the tree line, fired 2 rounds into the air, and shouted in broken English that Peterbers was now his prisoner. Two men, two survivors, two pilots whose war had ended within minutes of each other, within a few dozen kilometers of each other, without either of them ever knowing the other one existed. Now watch what happens next. Because 8 days after Walter Schock bailed out over central Germany, 300 kilometers to the south at the Munich-Riem airfield, Colonel Johannes Steinhoff is taxiing a Messerschmitt 262 down a runway pockmarked by American bombs. It is April 18th. Steinhoff is a legend. 176 aerial victories. Diamonds to the Knight's Cross. He advances the throttles. He begins his takeoff roll. He does not know that one of his tires, worn down by months of operations from bomb-damaged runways, has a hairline fracture along the sidewall. At 150 kilometers per hour, the tire fails. The 262 swerves off the runway, hits a bomb crater the ground crew never got around to filling, and cartwheels into a fireball that engulfs the entire aircraft. Steinhoff lives. He should not have, but he does. He crawls out of the burning wreck, with his face melted, his hands ruined, his eyelids burned away so completely that for the rest of his life, and he will live another 49 years, his eyes will never close properly again. 8 days later, on April 26th, General Adolf Galland, the man who had spent a year trying to warn Göring that this exact moment was coming, takes off from Munich in his own Messerschmitt 262, shoots down 2 American bombers, and is then pounced on by a P-47 Thunderbolt piloted by a young lieutenant named James Finnegan. Finnegan puts a burst of 50 caliber machine gun fire directly through Galland's cockpit. One round enters Galland's right knee. Galland crash lands in a field and passes out on the German grass while American fighters circle overhead, hesitating, for reasons no one will ever explain, to finish him off. In the final 3 weeks of the Second World War in Europe, the 3 most senior fighter pilots of the Messerschmitt 262 program were all removed from combat. Not one of them was killed in air-to-air combat. All 3 were struck down on or near a runway. The most advanced fighter aircraft in human history was defeated by the oldest principle of warfare. It cannot fight when it is on the ground, and in a farmhouse west of Magdeburg, in a bed with 2 swollen ankles wrapped in cloth soaked in cold water, Walter Schock is lying still. He is listening to the Soviet artillery in the east, growing closer every day. He is listening to the silence of the airfields which no longer send up jets because there is no fuel and no pilots and no country left to defend. And in the small dark hours of the night, when the pain in his ankles keeps him awake, Walter Schock begins to understand something he will not be able to say out loud for another 60 years. The man who shot him down did not just take his aircraft. The man who shot him down saved his life. But 60 kilometers to the west, in a column of Allied prisoners of war being marched under German rifles toward a camp called Stalag 3A at Luckenwalde, Joseph Peterbers was already walking. 10 days. 10 days on foot, sleeping in ditches, listening to Russian artillery grow louder every night. He reached Luckenwalde on approximately April 20th. The camp was overcrowded, filthy, and lightly guarded. Within a week, on a moonless night, Joseph Peterbers walked out of Stalag 3A. He did not have to tunnel. He simply walked into the dark countryside east of the camp and kept walking until he ran into a column of Soviet T-34 tanks. The Russians did not speak English. Peterbers did not speak Russian. But they understood the American star on his flight jacket, and they handed him a rifle and pointed him east. For the next 2 weeks, Joseph Peterbers, 20-year-old fighter pilot from Wisconsin, fought as an infantryman alongside a Soviet armored column from the outskirts of Berlin all the way to the Battle of Wittenberg on the Elbe. 2 enemies, 2 survivors of the same 8 minutes over Berlin. Their paths would not cross again for 60 years. But when they finally did, in a hotel lobby in the United States of America, in the summer of 2005, the first thing Walter Schuck would do, before he shook the American's hand, before he said a single word, would be to look Joseph Peterbers in the eye and begin to cry. Walter Schuck was released from the field hospital in early June of 1945. He walked out on ankles that had never properly healed, into a Germany that no longer existed. He limped home to Frankenholz. He took a job as a laborer. He married a local girl. He had children. He raised them the way his father had raised him, on black bread and root vegetables and the sound of church bells in the morning fog. And for 50 years, he did not speak of the war, not to his wife, not to his children, not to anyone. Walter Schuck did not want to be a hero. He did not want to be a villain. He wanted, more than anything in the world, to be forgotten. But the war would not forget him. 4,000 miles away, in a suburb of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, a young man named Joseph Peterbers was walking back into a life that had almost ended. He had come home to America on the 1st of June, 1945, from a French port on a troop ship crowded with returning prisoners of war. He had married his fiancée Josephine 13 days after his boots touched American soil on the 13th of June in a small Catholic ceremony. He had been born in St. Paul, Minnesota on the 25th of November, 1924, and raised in a working-class Milwaukee suburb where boys went either to the seminary or to the factory. Before Pearl Harbor, Joseph Peterbers had been on the seminary side of that fork. After Pearl Harbor, he took the other one. When the United States Air Force was established in 1947, Joseph Peterbers put on its blue uniform and continued to fly. He flew P-51 Mustangs in the Korean War, 76 combat missions. He transitioned to jets. He served as a staff operations officer during the Tet Offensive in Vietnam in 1968. He retired in 1979 at the rank of colonel, 36 years of active duty. And in all those years, Joseph Peterbers never talked about April 10th, 1945. Not because he was ashamed, because he did not know what to say. He had never claimed the 262 as a confirmed kill, because when he had fired at it that April afternoon over Berlin, he had only seen it disappear into a cloud, trailing smoke and fire. He had not seen it explode. He had not seen the pilot bail out. And a good pilot does not claim a kill he did not confirm with his own eyes. So the German jet went into his logbook as a probable, not a victory, a question mark. For 50 years, Joseph Peterbers lived with that question mark. He would probably die without knowing. And then, in the mid-1990s, a German television crew arrived in a field near Magdeburg with metal detectors and a shovel. They were there because of a man named Werner Dietrich. Werner Dietrich had been 13 years old on the 10th of April, 1945. He had been standing in a field near his village when he heard the engine of an American Mustang failing overhead. He had watched the pilot bail out at low altitude. He had watched the aircraft, a silver-blue fighter with the name Josephine, painted just below the cockpit, plow into the soft German earth and bury itself so deeply that the local villagers left it where it lay. Werner Dietrich had never forgotten. 51 years later, now a retired engineer, he had convinced a German documentary team to help him find that aircraft again. The excavation succeeded. On one of the recovered fragments, they found a serial number, 44-15078. American records identified the pilot as Second Lieutenant Joseph Anthony Peterbers. He was reported alive, living in the United States. Werner Dietrich wrote him a letter. That single letter would begin a friendship that lasted a decade. Werner Dietrich flew to America. Joseph Peterbers flew to Germany. The two men, the American pilot and the German boy who had watched him fall, stood together in the field where the Josephine had come to rest 51 years earlier. And somewhere in those long afternoons of conversation, over coffee at Herr Dietrich's kitchen table, Joseph Peterbers told the story of the Messerschmitt 262. Werner Dietrich listened, and then, quietly, he said something that would change everything. You know, an Me-262 fell in Germany that same afternoon, not far from where we found Josephine. Perhaps the pilot survived. Perhaps we could find out. Joseph Peterbers went very still. After 51 years of silence, the question mark in his logbook had just moved. Werner Dietrich contacted the German aviation research community. Historians pulled the loss records for the Luftwaffe on April 10, 1945. They cross-referenced them with the operational reports of Jagdgeschwader 7. Only one Me-262 was lost that day, in that area, in that time window. Its pilot had bailed out. He had sustained severe injuries to both ankles. He had spent the remainder of the war in a field hospital. The pilot's name was Walter Schuck. The historians stared at the name in the archive. 206 aerial victories, Knight's Cross with oak leaves, one of the highest-scoring fighter aces in the history of the German Luftwaffe. The German ace was alive. He was in his early 80s. He was still living in Frankenholz, and no one had ever told him the name of the man who shot him down. The meeting was arranged for the summer of 2005. Walter Schuck flew from Germany to the United States. He was 84 years old. He walked with a slight limp, the same limp he had carried since April 10, 1945. Joseph Peterbers met him in a hotel lobby. Peterbers was 80 years old. His hair was completely white. He was wearing a simple gray suit with a small pin on the lapel. The wings of a United States Army Air Corps fighter pilot, class of 1944. The two men stood approximately 6 feet apart. Neither of them spoke. There was a small crowd in the lobby. Journalists, veterans, family members, a television crew from a German documentary series. Cameras were rolling. Microphones were pointed. Everyone in the room was waiting to hear what a former Luftwaffe ace would say to the American who had ended his war. Walter Schuck looked at Joseph Peterbers. His eyes filled with tears. He stepped forward. He extended his hand. And in a soft, deliberate German-accented English, he said the 7 words that would define the rest of both of their lives. "You are the man who saved me." Joseph Peterbers did not understand at first. He took the German pilot's hand. He shook it. He tried to smile. But the words did not make sense to him. Not yet. He had come to this hotel expecting to meet an enemy. He had prepared himself for awkwardness, for polite hostility, perhaps even for anger. He had not prepared himself for gratitude. "I do not understand," he said. And so Walter Schuck told him. He told him about the ankles, about the 8 weeks in the field hospital, about the way the sprains had refused to heal. He told him about the days that followed, Steinhoff, Galland, the last 3 weeks of the war. I knew the pilots who died, Walter Schuck said. They were my friends. If I had been able to walk to my aircraft during those weeks, I would have been on those airfields when you Americans came. He looked at Joseph Peterbers. I would have died with them. The room was silent. Joseph Peterbers, 80 years old, veteran of 3 wars, retired colonel of the United States Air Force, did not know what to say. Walter Schuck said it for him. You shot me down, and you gave me 60 more years of life. The bullet that ended Walter Schuck's war did not end his life. It gave him one. A wife, children, grandchildren. 60 summers in the vegetable garden behind the house in Frankenholz. They became friends, not the polite kind of friends who exchange Christmas cards. Real friends, the kind who fly across oceans to attend each other's birthdays. Between 2005 and 2015, Joseph Peterbers and Walter Schuck met at air shows and museums and memorial ceremonies on both continents. They signed lithographs together for the aviation artist Robert Taylor, a famous print called Surprise Attack. They sat side by side on stages, telling their story to audiences of veterans and schoolchildren. And when Walter Schuck introduced Joseph Peterbers, he always used the same phrase, "This is the man who saved my life." They spoke often about the war, about the young men on both sides who had not lived long enough to have this conversation, about the strange, quiet weight of being the ones who survived. They did not speak about politics. They did not speak about ideology. They spoke about aircraft, about the smell of engine oil at dawn, about the sound of a Merlin engine at full military power, about the exact color of the sky over central Germany in April. They spoke about the things only 2 fighter pilots can understand. And in the summer of 2010, at an aviation event in the United States, an aviation historian handed the 2 men a photograph. It was a rendering of both of their aircraft. The Messerschmitt 262 on the right, still in flight, moments before the impact. The P-51 Mustang Josephine on the left, closing from above and behind. The historian asked them to sign it. They both did. Underneath his signature, Walter Schuck wrote, in careful blue ink, 4 words in German, Freunde für immer. Walter, friends forever. Walter. Walter Schuck died on the 27th of March, 2015. He was 94 years old. He died in his home in Frankenholz, in the same village where he had been born, in a bed a few feet from the window that looked out on the small vegetable garden he had tended for 70 years. Joseph Peterbers flew from the United States to Germany for the funeral. He was 90 years old. He walked into the small stone church in the Saarland, the same church Walter Schuck had walked into as a boy more than 80 years earlier, and he sat in the front pew next to Walter's widow, and he wept. He did not weep for a fallen enemy. He wept for a friend. The Luftwaffe of 1943, the confident, laughing Luftwaffe of Schweinfurt, is gone. Its pilots are gone. Adolf Galland lived to be 83. He became friends with British and American pilots he had once tried to kill. Johannes Steinhoff, whose face was melted at Munich-Riem, commanded the post-war West German Air Force. He forgave everyone. Heinz Baer, the man who called the P-51 Mustang the fighter that killed the Luftwaffe, died in a light aircraft crash in 1957, 12 years after the war. he never survived the peace. Walter Schuck was the last of them, the last of the great Messerschmitt 262 aces. When he died in 2015, an era in aviation history closed with him. There is no one left. No one who flew a jet fighter in combat for the Third Reich remains among the living. That knowledge is gone forever. But the story remains. Two enemies who did not know each other's names. Two survivors who would not meet for 60 years. Two old men who would eventually cross an ocean, shake each other's hand, and understand with the kind of clarity that only comes at the end of a long life. That the 8 minutes they had spent trying to kill each other in April of 1945 had, in the end, given them both everything they had. Their marriages, their children, their grandchildren, their friendships, the garden behind the house in Frankenholz, the Rocky Mountains outside the window in Colorado. All of it purchased at a price neither of them could have imagined on the morning of April 10th, 1945, when one of them climbed into a Messerschmitt 262 at Pachim, and the other climbed into a P-51 Mustang named Josephine at King's Cliff, and both of them lifted off into a sky that would decide in 8 minutes of combined flight time the rest of both of their lives. Joseph Peterbers is still alive. At the time of this telling, he is 101 years old. He lives in Colorado. He does not fly anymore, though in August of 2025, at 100 years of age, he climbed one more time into the back seat of a P-51 Hunt Mustang and lifted off from a small airfield in Northern California with his granddaughter, Sabrina, flying wingman beside him. He looked over at her, 2 feet away, through the canopy glass, and he smiled. And somewhere over the Pacific coastline, at 10,000 feet, an old man remembered a spring afternoon in 1945, and a German pilot he never saw, and 8 minutes over Berlin that had, in the end, given him 100 more years to live. The sky was blue. The engines sang. And Joseph Peterbers, 20-year-old lieutenant, 80-year-old grandfather, 100-year-old survivor, pressed his hand against the canopy glass and thought about Walter. Friends forever, Walter.